As Eric mentioned, I'm Sue Struve. I'm communications manager here at NASA for these 14 plus years. And it's really great to see such a large group of participants here with us today. I'm delighted that we're able to bring state arts agencies as well as cultural advocates together for this session. Now, all of us gathered here today are staff or volunteer. We have these staff or volunteer roles that require us to talk about the public value of the arts. We need to communicate in ways that educate people about the impact of our sector, and we need to express why public investment matters. So today we'll be hearing from 3 state arts agencies who are doing just that. All 3 of them are communicating strategically about the work that their agency does. Their approaches draw on NASAA's advocacy messaging framework. For those new to the field or who'd like a refresher, I'll share a little bit about that framework. Moving right along. Can everyone see the key challenges? Nod, thank you. We know that the arts make a big impact, and we also know that elected officials don't always see that. NASA wants to shift perceptions to help the arts be seen as a necessary and essential investment of public dollars. And that message needs to work across the entire political spectrum to drive home the idea that arts belong to everyone. We know that the arts make a big impact. We contracted with a firm called Metropolitan Group to create an advocacy messaging guide. A Metropolitan Group is a PR firm with lots of experience in building public will about important policy issues. We also put together a team of arts leaders to guide the work. Now, that team was diverse geographically, politically, and demographically. And that included arts advocates as well as former legislative staffers. Our research process analyzed what elected officials say about the arts. We also looked at other sectors that have improved their track records in obtaining public funding. And finally, we tested some draft messages with elected officials and used that feedback to refine our messaging. The process was grounded in framing science, which is a way to understand how to develop messages that resonate with the values of your intended audience. This is a proven method that has been used to shift public will on a wide variety of issues, including tobacco use, recycling, and environmental stewardship. I won't go through all the details on this slide, but that's the framing science illustration. The research resulted in Arts and Creativity Strengthen Our Nation, a narrative and message guide. This is a resource for framing our communications about public support for the arts. It gives us practical guidance about what to say and how to say it. It's available for free from NASA, and Eric will put a link to it to the message guide in the chat in a moment, or whenever he's ready. Now, the overarching narrative of the guide starts with Arts and Creativity Strengthen Our Nation. Now, beginning with the idea of strength lifts up what arts and creativity offer communities rather than asking for a handout. And the core message builds on that. I'll go ahead and read that because it's strong and powerful. Arts and creativity make us stronger as individuals, families, communities, states, and as a country. They are a backbone of innovation, prosperity, and thriving people and places. Public funding for arts and creativity is a high return investment that benefits every American in every city, town, and rural community nationwide. Now, I want to call out some important components of this message. First, the words arts and creativity are used together. Our testing showed that adding the word creativity makes our sector more universal and approachable. Notice also the words stronger and backbone. They connect with that idea of strength. And the last sentence is really important too. It connects public funding with an inclusive vision of every community. This corrects the mistaken notion that the arts are the province of the privileged few or just urban communities. So That's the core message, but we still need to exemplify how communities benefit, to tell stories that align the arts with what matters most to policymakers. So here are the themes that tested the best. First, economy. We've all been told that the main thing elected officials want to hear about is jobs. But our research showed that talking about arts employment is not compelling unless we couple it with the concept of how the arts help other sectors to grow, such as retail, restaurant, tourism. And the idea of innovation is persuasive, and tying the arts to workforce skills tested well as well. Now, healing was the #2 theme that elected officials found compelling. The people in our message testing pool were drawn to the idea of the arts as an agent for health and healing. Community connection and civic cohesion are important themes also. It's useful to talk about how the arts strengthen the fabric of communities and celebrate traditions and create places where people want to work and live and raise their family. Education was another top theme. Arguments about the importance of arts to academic success and workforce skills tested well. So this guide offers a general framework for communicating about the arts. It's inspiring, but it still needs to be brought to life by stories and adapted to different state settings. And that's what we're going to hear more about now. We are joined today by 3 state arts agency leaders who kindly offered to share their experiences in our session. Please wave when I call your name so folks know who you are. Michael Lange, Executive Director of the Wyoming Arts Council. Miah Michaelsen, Executive Director of the Indiana Arts Commission. And David Schmitz, Administrator of the Iowa Arts Council. So David Schmitz, let's start with you. Would you be able to share with the group what your needs have been at the Iowa Arts Council and how you've incorporated the suggestions from the Advocacy Messaging Guide into your work?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, my thanks to Sue and Eric for the invitation to be part of this afternoon with Miah and Mike. We're honored to participate here in Iowa. I initially, in all candor, hesitated to accept Sue's invite. We certainly don't have all the answers in Iowa, and we're always looking to learn as well. But I realized that I told Kelly Barsdate at one point what an amazing resource I thought this was. And since Kelly forgets nothing, I'm on the hook to tell you why we like it so much here in Iowa. So the short and straightforward answer to Sue's question is the guide addresses a couple of really relevant and timely needs here in Iowa. First of all, for those who don't know our state, Iowa is a smaller state that's almost perfectly split between urban and rural audiences. We have, for perspective, close to 1,000 incorporated towns. Some of them have fewer than 1,000 people. And then we also have one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country in Greater Des Moines. So I know many of you have that same kind of spectrum in your states. And so having language that kind of speaks to the center of a state like that, both geographically, politically, et cetera, is really helpful. But I want to just briefly come at Sue's question from a little different angle as well. And I want to just tell a quick short story. So back in 2017, as you'll all recall, we had just had an election and the new administration in Washington proposed to cancel out the budgets for all the federal agencies, as many of you will recall well. Like everyone in our field, went to DC for, at that time, a museum advocacy day. I know all of the advocacy days had record turnout. And what ended up happening, as you'll recall, is that the NEA received a funding increase in a divided Congress that year. And I think it's really relevant because partly it was about maybe relationships that had been developed with congressional staffs, but I also heard a very different message that I distinctly remember that year than what I often hear. It was a very focused message around not just the virtues of the arts, which we all can recite from heart, but also about what our communities would look like absent public investment in the arts. So I heard from my colleagues that year, less access to life-changing experiences for students, less creativity and opportunities in our school, less social well-being. And so fast forward a couple of years, I move into this role and NASAA releases this guide, and it kind of spoke to me on a very intuitive level I love the quote in the introduction about this guide moves the arts and creativity from niceties to core necessities for strengthening all of America. So I think it shifts the conversation to things that all people care about, including education, health, and well-being. And I also would argue that far from diluting the impact of the arts, it just provides some hooks for us as arts advocates to share all of the great stories and all of the great work under. I promise, Sue, I'm going to answer your question head on of what we're doing with it. Second quick story I want to share to illustrate the importance of this guide in our view. I also had the opportunity to work on a capital campaign with a museum. And I remember one time sitting down with somebody who works in economic development, had all my jobs numbers and the economic impact of our art museum ready. And I was a few minutes into it, and this individual says to me, that's all really nice, but I don't think that that's the power of the arts. I really care about how the arts benefit our schools and students. And that was a reminder to me to never assume we know what argument is going to resonate. And I think too often we do assume that either the economic or intrinsic side of arts advocacy is what we have to go with, or the, I guess, the instrumental side versus the intrinsic side. And I think, again, what this guide says to me is that it's all of the above. We need to be ready to customize those arguments according to who we're talking to. So what we're doing with this guide is a couple of things. In our community development, we're talking a lot about strengthening communities and how arts, culture, and creativity are really core to community development. Our director, Chris Kramer, also launched and co-chairs a creativity and innovation task force designed to really bring the arts, history, and humanities into STEM. And so that's been a huge focus for us. And so I would just say, in closing on that question, Sue, whether it's, policy, whether it is marketing materials, promotion, we are constantly trying to weave in that language to really be a little bit more inclusive across our state.
Awesome, thank you, David. Miah, I'd like to turn to you for the next question. How have you married the advocacy messaging with programs and activities and tools and such at your at the Indiana Arts Commission?
Yeah, thanks. And again, thanks NASAA for the opportunity to talk about this. This messaging guide's been really, really important to us over the last 12 months. So what we're using, it in several ways. And what first I'll start with, right after the guide rolled out, we asked Pam Bro to come to our statewide conference, and she presented on the messaging guide. And we essentially did sort of a mini training for the field about how to think about the messaging guide. And then the pandemic hit, and then frankly, we put the messaging guide along with a lot of other things to the side, thinking we just got to get through this, right? So, but we as an agency, we're heading at the end of last year, heading into a new budget setting cycle with the legislature. And we knew that this was an opportunity to sort of shift the conversation, to turn the page, to talk about the arts differently. But we knew we needed a pretty decent runway to do that leading up to the session that's occurring right now. And so we began with a series of conversations around the state where we began to use what was in the messaging guide when we did essentially what I call our chicken dinner circuit, when we went around and spoke to small communities about the arts. We began to use the guide and talk about the core benefits. And what we learned pretty quickly from that was that messaging really resonated with folks from around the state when they couldn't quite understand how the arts might benefit their communities, to talk about it through a frame of health and well-being or education. That really resonated. And it really began to pop once we married it with AFTA's social impact wheel, which some of you are probably familiar with. And I think Eric's going to drop it in the chat. There's a lot of great data and research around how the arts impact a variety of social impact areas, and we began to include those as data and research to bolster the four core messaging areas. And then we married that with specific stories of organizations in the state that were working in those areas. And all of that began to sort of congeal, and we added bits and pieces, and now we have a fairly extensive slide deck, and I think Eric will drop it in here. I'll give you at least a PDF of it that shows kind of how we use it sort of broadly, but being able to tie a specific research about health and well-being, or the impacts on education, or the positive indicators for older adults, really began to shift the conversation, and we could really feel momentum around understanding and appreciation of art's role, again, throughout the lives of our residents. We followed up by putting language in our budget request. We followed up by doing information cards that we go out when we do public appearances. We share those, and all of those reinforce those 4 core messages, depending on who the audience that we're speaking with. So for us, it's been really an additive approach. And again, it all depends on what your audience needs to hear, to David's point, right? Some audiences, we speak more to the education benefits, and some we speak more to health and well-being. But luckily for us, in this particular session, the governor has put a significant emphasis on improving health and well-being and investing in mental health. And so we were ready with messaging around mental health benefits and physical health benefits of the arts that we could just come alongside and say, and here are ways that we can help. So again, I think we're using it a lot, but I feel like we're still just scratching the surface of all the things that this messaging guide can do for us. And we're actually now training in communities how they can think about using the messaging guide for their own local advocacy, and doing workshops on how to do that. So for us, it's been really a huge springboard for messaging, but also additional connection in communities. So we're huge fans.
Wow, that is great. You just grabbed it with both hands. Okay, Michael Lange, I feel like Judy Woodruff. Michael Lange, can you share how the guide has helped the Wyoming Arts Council communicate with legislators, whether they're progressive, centrist, or conservative?
Yeah, you bet. And thanks so much for having me as well. Unlike David, I do have all the answers, and I will share them with you right now. So a bit about Wyoming for folks who don't know much about the state. It is the least populated state in the nation. Sits at about 600,000 people, and our legislature is a complete volunteer legislature. So they meet for 45 days, 1 year, 60 days the following year. Of the 31 senators and 62 62 representatives, there are 5 Democrats that are part of our legislature. And really it's about, there's kind of 2 caucuses in the Republican Party, kind of a right-leaning caucus and a far right-leaning caucus. So, it is interesting. Several years ago, the folks who we felt were very conservative legislators in our state are now considered moderates. So it's just kind of the way of the world in the politics of our states. With the concept that they're all volunteer, there's actually no staff associated with any of the legislators. There is a legislative services office, which helps staff all of the legislators, but there's no individual staff. And I think the good and bad of this is you really do have access to your legislators in a small state like Wyoming. It also means that lobbyists have a strong tie to legislators as well. And a great deal of the information that comes to legislators does come through lobbyists and comes through constituents. And I think legislators, for the most part, want to hear from their constituents and are not always necessarily interested of hearing from myself, for instance, or from our board, but are really interested of hearing from people living inside of their community. So we have for years talked with our different grantees and different artists and different community organizations about meeting with and speaking with their legislators about the value of what they do. And a lot of the feedback we had heard from our constituents and our grantees is like they feel really comfortable talking about how the funding or the programs that they're taking part in, that the Arts Council is doing or any of the other entities in the state are doing, but they have never felt like they had a great tie to like what's the bigger purpose of what they're talking about. So I think this gave us the ability to kind of have a framework or an umbrella or an area where constituents felt like they could talk about the programs they were doing and where it kind of fit into the larger picture. So we have really been using it as as an umbrella for organizations to think about the work that they're doing and how they can plug it into these different areas. We like many states have always kind of left created an annual report, like a 1 or 2 page leave behind that we would give to legislators. And 2 years ago, I watched us hand this to a legislator and watched him glance at it and went directly into the garbage. And we're like, I wonder if there is a better way, a better way to do this. So one of the pieces that we created was a short video that really kind of focused on these. Really, it's a set of videos. We did a set of 3 videos, but kind of focused on this framework of talking about the value of the arts and, push this out to our constituents who could then use it to plug in their information. And I think Eric has one of those pulled up that we could watch for a moment. It's just like a minute and a half or so. Yeah. Great. So just to check, when we decided to kind of switch this focus from a written paper leave behind that we would kind of put in everyone's box to these videos, we kicked around, we had a couple meetings and we kicked around a bunch of ideas about what the focus would be. And then, then we remembered, that NASA put this tool together for us. And, we pulled it up and we were all looking at it like, this is exactly how we should focus this effort. And it was, I felt in a way we were kind of trying to reinvent the wheel by ourselves and, in our Zoom meetings. So it was really great to have this, to have this tool.
Wow, thanks. Your videos are very impressive. And the music is great. I can't sit still listening to that music. So let's move back to David. And I wonder whether you would like to add to Miah's comments about how your agency has meshed advocacy messaging with various tools and programs and activities.
you can tell that Sue comes prepared. We may have chatted about that a little bit. Yeah, perfect bridge there, because I did want to jump on to what Miah said. First of all, the BEA data, we do weave it in a lot with that. So I'm sure everybody on this call is familiar, but the work that NASA does using the Bureau of Economic Analysis each year, the creative industry profiles. If you're not using that, I would highly recommend it. We are on that site all of the time, pulling that data for presentations. I noticed my colleague Kim from North Dakota in the chat mentioned using this in your legislative proposals. I think that has been successful for us as well. And we also, for us in Iowa, 43,000 arts and culture workers, an industry of $4.2 billion. Those are obviously figures right before the pandemic, but those have still been really valuable numbers for us, that at least for those who look at the arts through that economic frame, it does grab their attention. It does start a conversation. Another report that I would highly recommend for those of you who are in states with large rural populations is that Rural Prosperity Through the Arts study that NEA collaborated on with the National Governors Association. We frequently weave those two studies together, or that study and the data from NASAA with a lot of this messaging as well. Just a few other things that we have been doing as well. Our statewide arts advocacy organization, the Iowa Cultural Coalition, they have really adopted a lot of the same language in their materials. And so that's nice to have some alignment with them. We launched a reopening campaign in 2021 around the return of arts and culture in our state. And I think to the earlier point you made, Sue, when you were sharing the slides, talking about creative industries and talking about the creative economy allows you to really make that point that arts and cultural organizations do so much for our small businesses and restaurants. These are vital industries. And so making that connection that we support in good times and in bad, that industry has something that's gotten traction for us here for sure. We also, I didn't include this in the chat, but have a creative places focus in our community development area. So we have been producing videos. We have an amazing videographer, Dan Bolsom here, who has shot some great videos connecting our cultural districts and our Iowa Great Places. And again, instead of using kind of jargony program language to describe what's happening in these communities, we've increasingly been pulling that under an umbrella of Iowa's creative places, and then using some of the messaging in the NASAA guide to describe what those communities do. And then finally, and I think Eric is just going to throw these in the chat, we're gearing up to kind of launch a campaign called Create in Iowa. I may have mentioned in my beginning remarks that one of Iowa's big challenges is just growing its population. We are a slower population growth state right now, and so there's a huge amount of emphasis on attracting new people to our state. And so again, using some of this language around creativity has really, I think, helped us to get a little bit more traction with some folks.
Sue, you're muted.
I said, excellent, excellent. Let's move back to Miah. And I wonder if, Miah, you've already alluded to some of this, but I wonder if you could share some ways that the advocacy messaging guide is changing and refining your messaging.
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, we are making sure that we are using the strength frame in pretty much every opportunity we have to speak or address the public, and certainly we weave it into our news releases. And I mean, it's kind of everywhere. I mean, it's not, try not to overuse it, but we're making sure that some element of that messaging shows up in every external communication we do, whether or not it's, you know, again, cutting a ribbon at an event or speaking at the Hoosier Women Artists opening or anything, that we're bringing in some facet of that strength messaging in conversation and presentation, just to, again, to help reiterate and reinforce the message, which means that you've got to have a lot of message discipline, right? You've got to make sure that you're paying attention to it, and that you're always making sure that it's inclusive. And we have a great comms team, Taya and Connie, and they make sure they essentially run it through the strengthen filter to make sure we've got something in whatever messaging it is that supports that overall messaging frame for us as an agency. But it does require a lot of, you've got to pay attention. But I think, again, for us, it's been worth it.
Terrific, thank you. And how about you, Michael? Can you, how has the guide helped to refine your advocacy messaging or any of your communications?
Yeah, great question. So, I think a lot like Miah said, we've been, the beauty of it is it could be really quick, right? You may have 15 or 20 seconds and you may have 100 words to describe something, and you can find something like that from the guide. Or if you have, if you have a 30-minute talk you need to do to the Rotary Club, or I don't know, some group in your state, you can also use that guide in that situation as well. So I think it's been helpful for us in those areas of trying to wrap it into a lot of our communication. I also, we have specifically not been having all the staff use these talking points in like all the situations, and I think some of this definitely relates back to what I was saying about having a volunteer legislature. There'll be times where you can, where lobbying groups will be texting legislators on the floor, and you'll be watching them kind of read from the same talking points on the floor of the floor of the House and Senate, which is not ideal. So we didn't want it to just seem like, there's only 5 things we can talk about with the arts, and it's these 5 bullet points. But I think it has been helpful for us to, like I said earlier with our constituents, have kind of an umbrella for where to like plug information into, and really kind of focus on the programs that we are offering and the constituents are offering to their communities with a kind of a framework to look at. Yeah, so maybe an example of this, if Eric would be up for playing that second video, just the same kind of concept as the first one, but more so focused on stuff we would usually put in a leave behind for legislators, kind of wrapped up in this video. So I think that's just kind of one example of, how we've been trying to use the messaging, but tie it into other, pieces and stories that we want to tell about what we're doing at the Arts Council.
Yeah, another awesome video. Yeah, I like how your videos are very tailored to your state. Just like the messaging has to be tailored to each state. You've got mountains, et cetera. But as far as the political leanings or the the geographical disbursement or whatever, demographics, et cetera. So nice. Well, listen, thank you all for some really helpful models and information. I know that hearing these brass tacks examples and how you've customized your messaging is giving our participants some great ideas of their own. And speaking of participants, we've had some questions coming through the chat. And I'll turn that over to Eric. Or have we had questions coming through the chat, Eric? I've got a couple questions if we haven't had any yet, but I'll turn it over to you for starters.
I do have a quick question for Michael that actually just came through to me. People were just kind of wondering a little bit about how you went about creating those videos. Like, how did you go about, the process of figuring out how you were going to do them, how you're going to break them out? If you could just talk a little bit about the process on that decision making.
Yeah, you bet. So, we didn't have a clear idea when we first sat down, and I felt like we were kind of talking in circles. We knew we wanted them to be short because the concept that, you could drop it in an, in an email to someone or, use it on social media, in the likelihood that if you put that it was 1 minute and 30 seconds long, that someone might actually click on it and not feel like they needed, to watch a 20-minute video. So that was definitely a piece of the puzzle. And, a lot of the conversation around us wanting to get back into it was how could we, coming out of COVID, talk about the value of the work we were doing. COVID relief money was drying up, and we knew that we wanted to be able to talk about the value of what those projects had been able to accomplish in our state. And like I said, we went back and forth for quite some time about how to exactly fit into this, and that's where this framework came in handy. So we worked specifically with an artist who did all the put the videos together, and we actually shared the link to the framework and talked about some ideas that we thought would fit well into this, and he kicked some ideas back to us and sent us some sketches, and we went back and forth on that, and that's where we landed with the development of the videos.
Thank you, Michael. I think that was very helpful. I know we had a follow-up question about how you paid for it, and it sounds like you answered that. So I have a question for David, and then I might pop back to you as well, Michael. Have your state's advocacy groups picked up on the messaging? Have you worked with them, married your kind of messaging with them in any way?
To some degree, and I want to align with something that Michael said a little while ago. I think Michael, if I heard you correctly, you said not having your staff or board or everyone singing the same songbook too much. And I think we've taken that same approach with our advocacy group, because again, yeah, you don't want things to be so coordinated that people feel like it is just coming from a place of lobbying. So we've kept a little bit of distance there. But I think certainly they've picked up, particularly on the numbers about the number of Iowans who work in these industries, the notion of strengthening communities around these areas, and folded some of it in.
Michael,
Yeah.
how about you in Wyoming?
You bet. Yeah, we're kind of in the same boat as David. We specifically did not put them together for that exact reason. We didn't want it to sound like it was coming from a lobbying group, for instance. Just like why we stay away from sending out a blanket form that people can plug into to write their legislators, right? As the legislators get a ton of that, and most of it just goes directly to junk mail or gets deleted. So I think being able to we use the same data points definitely to talk about, but not in the same framework, which I think has actually been helpful for us.
Thank you both. Miah, I have a question. I'm going to start with you and then maybe flood over to the other two. One of our participants was struck by your phrase message discipline. to make sure that everyone was echoing the same ideas consistently. And you mentioned training you did for your constituents to help them with that. But what about council members? Have you done any work around unified messaging with your council members?
Great question, and we haven't, and that's certainly something that we've contemplated. You know, we don't have an advocacy organization in Indiana, so we are our own advocates at the Arts Commission. So we do provide them information about, you know, again, how we're framing, in particular, our budget ask or our conversations we may be having with legislators, but we have not done a training, and I think that's a great idea because, again, when we've done local trainings, they have been really well received, and I'm sure our commission members would appreciate getting something a little more in depth. So absolutely something for us to think about for sure.
Great, thank you,
I
Maya.
imagine you had some commission members attend your conference that Pam spoke
Yes,
at. That was a few years ago.
yeah.
But
And we did have, yeah, and in some of the community trainings that we've done have been on the invitation of commissioners who have been at those. So some of them certainly received that, but yeah, as a unified group, not so much. But great thing to think about for the future, for sure.
Thank you, Maya. Michael, David, have either of you worked with your council members around messaging from the guide?
No, we haven't. And I mean, it's an interesting idea. I do wonder if we kind of run into the same, you know, the same issue that David and I were talking about earlier. You know, our council members, I think like many, are also spread around the state and are very active in the arts community, and many of them serve in, you know, at arts organizations. And I think the value of them being able to talk about what they do on a local level is probably more valuable than necessarily using the messaging exactly as the council staff is putting it out.
Yeah, we're in the same boat there. We really have not tried to have our council per se take those messages home with them. I agree that it's more powerful for them to talk about. All of them are leaders in their communities, and for them to speak first and foremost to how their mission and what they're doing is then supported by the State Arts Council. I will say on trainings, I'm pretty sure, I don't know if George or any of his team from Wisconsin are with us. I'm pretty sure that they have done some trainings around this. So I want to recognize them, as well as Vermont is a state that we certainly look to a lot for leadership around this creativity piece.
And I'll just jump in to say that we will be using elements of the messaging frame to help frame up our budget request, and commissioners will be having one-on-one conversations with some legislators, so they will receive that material for sure, because that again anchors our funding request for this biennium. But yeah, no training, but I think it's a great idea.
Right, I have a question for all three of you, or you can jump in if you have an answer to this at least. Have any of your legislators been, you know, convinced of the value of public funding on the arts since you started this messaging? Have you seen that light bulb go off? Are there any stories you can tell about interactions with any of your legislators like that?
I do not.
I'll go ahead, Michael.
I do not have a cool story like that. You know, I definitely have had some like, oh, that's interesting. That's an interesting way to talk about it, which is like kind of a win in some ways. It's not like a negative response. So sometimes like no response or a ho-hum response is better than a negative response. So, you know, I kind of think of that as a win. But what I have heard is not a lot, which I think in some ways is really great, because I think they're hearing that message in a way that, you know, some of them are not negatively responding to, which I think is a positive.
And I would just say when we hear when we see light bulbs go off, it's with local elected officials. Almost exclusively, because we're seeing a lot of communities, we're seeing a lot of funding opportunities coming to communities, and communities really thinking about quality of place and quality of life. And so in a way, we're looking at this messaging guide as a permission structure to invest in the arts in their community. And by providing some benefit messaging that is beyond the beauty and grace, allows them to think about leveraging ARPA dollars that seem like an endless river in our state currently, that are getting pushed down to the local level. And again, where we're seeing that is really from local elected officials, which we are perfectly happy with. And we would love to see, again, more local investment in arts and creativity in places. And so if that's where it moves the needle for us, we couldn't be happier. So we are certainly seeing light bulbs go off with mayors, city council members, and so forth. And in particular, in really rural places where, again, their citizens their residents are asking for it, but they didn't previously know quite how to justify it. And we've given them some ways to justify it. And I can't tell you how many times I've distributed the slide deck with the data, with AFTA's social impact information to community members, because they're hungry for that information about how do they talk about the arts in such a way that allows them to invest in it in their communities.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I've used up my storytelling quota for this webinar, but I can't think of one pithy story to share either. I do think Miah mentioned the American Rescue Plan funds and the push that we all made in our states. Our department was part of that push here in Iowa. We did have $100 million investment in place-based projects, including a lot of arts and culture that's still ongoing this year. And I do think this type of messaging contributed to that successful push. I don't think it's determinative. And I still think at the end of the day, a good story about the impact of the arts on one person or the lives of a community is still the most important. But I think this data complements and this way of framing the argument creates focus, I think, for a lot of busy people, including legislators.
Great, thank you. I have another kind of message for anyone who wants to answer to jump in on. Are you experiencing different reactions to the messaging particularly around health and education post-pandemic as compared to pre-pandemic? Go ahead, Miah.
I would say absolutely. Our governor has proposed in the current budget a huge new investment in mental health. And I'd love to say that was a result of our messaging. It's not, of course, but it's a recognition that that states need to invest more in mental health, and states need to invest more in education. And they're thinking about education more broadly, and they're thinking about any way that advances positive outcomes for children and teens. They're grasping at that. And so again, we're sliding in with lots of justification, and again, that permission structure to think about investing in broader ways. And they also have the money to do it now, which helps. So we are absolutely seeing interest, much higher level of interest in mental health and well-being and education as a result of the pandemic.
Great, thank you, Miah. Michael, I think I saw you on mute as well.
Yeah, so I think definitely around mental health and aging communities in Wyoming. Wyoming is definitely, is growing larger with aging communities than younger communities. So I think that is definitely a piece that ties in. The education is interesting, I think, in Wyoming. Like, this is the first time. So I've been at the council now a decade, and this is the first time since I've been there that there hasn't been a year-over-year cut to the state budget and to the state employees. And it's holding solid. At the moment, Wyoming is a large extraction industry state. I think 70 to 80% of our taxes actually come from the sale of oil and gas and coal, which is a large number. So that of course has been down a ton over the last decade, which makes complete sense. And there's this little uptick right now. So it feels a bit like the Wild West to me right now, where there is some money laying around and everyone's trying to get a piece of it and trying to, you know, stuff it away into their pockets in one way or another. And I don't have a clear, I don't think a clear message really coming from anyone has been very helpful. Conversations around education and critical race theory and you know, so has been a complication to, I think, make any progress around talking about the value of arts and culture in education. So no, I don't think there has been a great connection to the messaging specifically right now, as far as that relation.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I was going to stay muted until the last 10 seconds of what Michael said. I want to identify with something he said. I think the needs have changed in Iowa, but I don't know that the messaging environment has been able to change with it. I envy Miah's ability to move forward proposals around the arts and healing and mental health. I think the culture wars, frankly, are a huge distraction in our state as well. I think there's a lot of bills that come out that I think shift the conversation to that and kind of interrupt that scaffolding maybe that we're all trying to build as arts advocates. And there's nothing you can do about that whatsoever. So I would say that that's been a headwind for us.
Great. Thank you all. I have one final question for you. Again, it's a jump in if you like to share anything. Do any of you have any future plans on how you're going to use the messaging that you can share with us?
Yeah, I'd be happy to go first. You know, so we are still using it in a handful of, you know, like I have a handful of talks coming up over this this kind of spring semester period that we're using it in. We just did it in a handful of op-eds that went out that were, you know, specifically focused to go out during the legislative session. But as far as like, what does the future hold with it? I think that's an interesting question. And I think it's an interesting question for NASAA too, as far as like these you know, a lot of time, energy, and resources were put into creating this. And at some point, like we will have used up these talking points in a way that they may not be heard as much as when they were fresh. So, you know, it's an interesting question of like, what does the next, you know, what does the next series of this mean? Is this an ongoing living document that NASAA is helping develop? You know, like we're talking after COVID now, like my guess is like a lot of these are still ring true, but what, you know, what will this after messaging do? What will this kind of large spree of federal money that's, you know, rolling into all of the states, and, you know, a lot of states' budgets are pretty healthy right now, not all, but a lot of them, like what happens when that dries up? How does that messaging change? So I think it's a good question, and one that I would definitely like NASAA to think about what's the next iteration of this work for sure.
Thank you, Michael. David, Miah, do you have any future plans or directions you're looking at?
So I'll just jump in and say a couple of things. We plan to do some more local training using the messaging guide. So, and that would be a direction I'd love to see NASAA go in, which would be how to actually take this messaging into, you know, into work with local advocacy, because that's really where we're focused right now, is again building advocacy networks and building public policy and funding networks in local communities. And so it's been well received, but we've kind of MacGyvered it from the messaging guide. I'm sure NASAA, if they were to put together a local training, would be far better than what we've put together. So would love some additional conversation. Absolutely, Michael's spot on. And, you know, what's next? I also think, you know, we've touched a little bit on the, you know, again, all the cultural issues that are popping up now. How does the messaging guide respond to those and make space for those and refute those? again, by being inclusive and being both, being inclusive of an agreed to set of messaging around the benefit to the arts, right? How do we do that? So I think will be an interesting direction. And we're going to be distributing Governor's Arts Awards or awarding Governor's Arts Awards this year. We would anticipate that at least some of the core benefit messaging will show up. We plan to do videos, probably not as spiffy as Michael's, but we're going to be doing videos or short films on all the recipients. And we would imagine that some of that benefits messaging will crop up in some of the scripted work around the Governor's Arts Awards. So we're hoping that this is a jumping off point in the beginning of a messaging conversation with NASAA. So again, we appreciate them getting us started, and we look forward to going deeper.
Thank you, Miah. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I would say that I'm probably the newest of my 3 colleagues to the state arts agency field, but I would suspect that the work ahead for us is the same work that has always been there for the field, which is kind of marrying sound cultural policy proposals with good messaging and advocacy, and ultimately pushing for funding. And I think that third piece here in Iowa, we hang down there in the mid-40s for funding per capita. And so that piece is a little bit more urgent maybe than colleagues in some other states. So really, we're going to stick with this messaging guide and I think the wisdom embedded in it, and try to find a true line through some of the politics of the moment.
Thank you very much, David. And I just want to say thank you all for presenting. And those of you whose questions I didn't get to, rest assured, I'll follow up with an email to connect you to Miah, Michael, and David with your questions so that you can chat via email to get those answered. I'm going to turn it back to Sue, who's going to wrap it up for us today. Sue?
Thank you, everybody. Let's see, where am I here? I just wanted to, of course, thank our speakers for all that they've shared, and also mention that in addition to the advocacy messaging guide, NASAA, you can find lots of other tools on the NASAA website to support your advocacy work and storytelling. Just go to our website and click the Advocate tab at the top, and you're always welcome to reach out to us for assistance. So thank you again to everyone who shared today and who joined us today. And thanks for all that you do each and every day to spread the message that arts and creativity strengthen our nation. Have a wonderful day, everyone.